Welcome, my friends, to Inside the Minds of Authors. I'm DC Gomez, and I'm thrilled you're joining me today for a fun conversation with a passionate author. We're kicking off the program, like it's our tradition, with a short reading from the feature book. I hope you guys enjoy it. Let's get started.
So my novel is called The Middle Generation, a novel of John Quincy Adams and the Monroe Doctrine. It's a historical fiction novel. I'm going to read a special scene for everybody. Just a quick intro to what the scene is about. In this novel, our main protagonist and narrator, John Quincy Adams, has recently become the Secretary of State to President Monroe. And in this scene, he and his wife had visited his parents, John and Abigail Adams, John Adams being the second president, and he and his father are taking a walk in the wintry December of Massachusetts. We exited the house. The wind had calmed, but the air was colder, besting the sun's efforts. I tracked father as we walked the trail we'd used many times before, a flickering of memories, some pleasant, others buried. The worst moment of my youth happened there. Father, with mother's blessing, pressured me into breaking my engagement with Mary Fraser, a young girl to whom I'd pinned all hopes of happiness. Father was silent, and I decided to prompt him. I don't seek counsel on policy. A moment. My words went unheard. Then, good. I don't seek to give it. I am too old and have been out of action too long to be useful. Unlikely. I'd rather discuss issues closer to home. Go on. He sighed. Your mother was my closest advisor, and my wisest. When I look at you and Louisa, a moment. Do you talk to her about your work? No. You should. Louisa has a limited understanding of politics and world events. Teach her. Bring her up to speed. Though you're wrong. She was a minister's wife in Europe. Befriended Emperor Alexander in St. Petersburg, witnessed Napoleon's conquests. My image of her was forever changed when she told me of how she crossed the continent with young Charles alone for 6 weeks, and French soldiers intercepted them in a Russian carriage. Her improvisation saved your family. That does not mean she knows how to manage France and Russia. You're making a mistake, Johnny. He made eye contact. I'm fond of Louisa. Marrying her was the most important event of your life. Turning away, no matter what office you may obtain. I turned backward, not wanting us to go out too far in case the wind resumed. How are the boys? He asked. What? I asked, how are the boys? Oh, they're fine. How old are they now? George is 16, John is 14, and Charles is 10. How is George's education progressing? I groaned. I don't know what to do with him. He's stupid and weak. What does Louisa think? She's soft with him, with all of them. Charles's French is improving, but the others are behind. Ashamed children are not clay to be made according to the fancy of every potter. Remember that an education should include a knowledge of history in general, and of England, France, Holland, and America in particular. Have them read whatever legal text you can, no matter the age, and the memoirs of great men. I know, Father. I remember how you raised me. I model my approach to fatherhood on you. Just don't pressure them too much. Is such a thing possible? Yes, look at your brothers. But look at me. What about you? I didn't turn out like Tom and Charles. I suppose not. He growled within each breath. I wanted to return home soon. I wish you'd had more success as a lawyer. You could have been great, but you are too disposed to despondency. It didn't interest me. You didn't give it a chance. Spent your law school years playing cards and chasing girls. The profession requires time to earn appreciation. It was a bad fit. My mind didn't work that way. You determine how your mind works. He looked back and then said to me, realize where you started in life, Johnny. History won't give me my due. I won't be credited for my role in the Revolution. The parts performed by General Washington, Mr. Jefferson, and Dr. Franklin will be exaggerated instead. but we are still one of America's leading families. You came into life with advantages that will disgrace you if your success is mediocre. I am the Secretary of State. You must become president. He started toward home. I followed. My position makes me heir apparent. The last 3 presidents all held my office before ascending to the executive mansion. That's not a guarantee. A guarantee is impossible. It was for General Washington. You are not he, but it can still be done. How? Find a way, Johnny, and you must win 2 terms to make up for my loss to Jefferson. Restore the family legacy. I swelled with anxiety. This was the period where I'd succeed or fail to fulfill my destiny. I was again the 8-year-old father took across the Atlantic during the War for Independence. You once told me that you studied politics in war so I may study mathematics and philosophy, and I had to study mathematics and philosophy so my children could study painting and music. Father chuckled. There will always be a need for politics, son. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. I am not advising you. I'm telling you, you must achieve the presidency for your own worth and for mine, for our families. You must succeed. Yes, Father. My mind raced faster than I could follow. Crawford, Onus, Metternich, only a few of the obstacles I faced. It was now an issue of life and death. Failure would destroy me and my family, a disgrace for generations, through history, my name synonymous with shame. Mother waited for us as we approached home. Louisa is chatting with Tom and Nancy. I was reminding Johnny of our expectations of him, Father said. Yes, we shall have a 2-term president in this family. Father chuckled, embracing the joke at his expense. My anxiety doubled. Remember to not look back or shrink from your duty, however arduous or dangerous the task assigned you, Mother said. And never forget virtue. It's equally important. Purge any old world values you absorbed from your soul. Your great intellect counts for little if virtue, honor, and integrity aren't added to it. I'd much rather you found your grave in the ocean while returning from Europe than see you an immoral profligate or a graceless man. The highest goals that parents could have for their child, the heights of ambition and virtue. They wanted the impossible, yet I had no choice but to obey. The first and deepest of all my wishes, I said, is to give satisfaction to my parents.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Inside the Minds of Authors. I hope you guys enjoyed that reading as much as I did because I can't wait to start talking about it. Just a quick note, if you're new to the podcast, go ahead, subscribe. You don't want to miss a single episode. And if you want to see the behind the scenes of what goes on in the podcast, join the Podcast Junkie or Patreon group so you can give us that extra love and make sure you don't miss a single thing. So we're going to get started because you guys all here to figure out who we have. And it's December, it's the end of our season, so the authors are so fabulous. Hello, dear. How are you, Michael?
Good, how are you?
I'm fabulous. I'm so glad you came back to talk to us. We mentioned this book literally a year ago. So the fact that you're finishing the season again is super funny. I need to know about this book, the process, and why did you pick this? So tell us.
Yeah, so the book is called The Middle Generation, a novel of John Quincy Adams and the Monroe Doctrine. So it's a historical fiction novel about, as you would guess, John Quincy Adams. It's about his time as Secretary of State. Historians consistently rank him as the greatest Secretary of State in American history, likely the greatest diplomat that we've ever had. He is the eldest son of John Adams, the second president. The title, The Middle Generation, implies that it is so of the classical era of American history, which starts with the founding and ends with the Civil War. This is the second of the 3 generations and the one that gets very frequently overlooked because it's sandwiched between, probably the 2 biggest events in American history. So by looking at John Quincy Adams in this period, we can sort of get a larger appreciation of this sort of overlooked era. A lot of the major figures of that era, big names that most people have heard of, but maybe don't know a ton about, people like Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, Andrew Jackson, and even President James Monroe himself, who's considered the last president who was a founding father. And The main storyline, I think, it's a major world crisis I think most people have very little about. It deals with the South American Wars for independence. So this story is set in the immediate aftermath of Napoleon's defeat in Europe. And one step that Napoleon took in his sort of several wars was to invade Spain and to try to knock out Portugal, which was an ally of Britain. And by doing that, at this point, Spain and Portugal controlled all of South America. And by doing that, it threw the entire Spanish Empire into a legitimacy crisis, and South America rose up against Spain and fought a series of wars for independence. Somebody like General Bolivar is sort of the most famous figure of that conflict. Most Americans were, very supportive of this because they, saw kind of like the continent to the south sort of duplicating what we'd done a generation prior in the American Revolution. The problem was that, now that Napoleon was defeated, all of Europe was sort of unified under a very, I'm going to use a term, but it means something specific, and I don't want this to come off as reflecting current partisanship in any way, a very conservative alliance of countries. Conservative in this context meaning sort of supporting sort of an very autocratic monarchy, sort of religious-based rule, thinking of what the world was like before the American Revolution and the Enlightenment, who saw everything that the United States stood for as sort of illegitimate and blamed our revolution on the French Revolution and Napoleon, and thought that South America's independence was just going to cause another conflict like that in Europe. So they opposed South American independence and were threatening to either invade and reimpose the Spanish Empire. And then there's the question of where does Britain fit into this? Because Britain is sort of kind of understands both sides of this conflict. And it's that large sort of diplomatic mess that John Quincy Adams, as Secretary of State, has to navigate. And the Monroe Doctrine is sort of the culmination of this. So that's sort of the main storyline. Prior books was the Eisenhower Chronicles, which looked at General and President Eisenhower through World War II and the early Cold War. And I just felt like I had grown a lot as a writer, especially with historical fiction and these type of topics, writing that book. And I wanted to do a somewhat similar topic to kind of see if I could put what I'd learned to the test and see what I could do with it. And this was the result.
I'm very excited about it. I'm always curious because you always pick these moments in times and most people are like, oh, okay, what? What happened? So I'm so excited about this because you're right. Nobody thinks about this period in timeline between the American Revolution as well as the war. You hear about it in eighth grade when you look into American history, and we pass it very quickly. So the question for you is, how much research did you have to do to get all of these facts backed? Because nobody really is paying that much attention to it.
I accumulated over 400 pages of research notes that I was looking at constantly. One thing I didn't fully understand before starting this process was that John Quincy Adams kept a diary throughout his entire life that became 51 volumes long.
Oh, wow.
And thankfully, the Massachusetts Historical Society digitized it and built in a search engine, because otherwise this project would have taken much longer if I even continued attempting something like that, given the scale of that resource. But it is sort of like this ultimate primary resource of kind of both tracking his thoughts about things and just how events played out over time, and being able to sort of take large passages of it to use as sort of like raw material for building both scenes and dialogue. It's a very dialogue heavy book, sort of like the debate and the strategic, both thinking and arguments, is kind of like the action of it.
I need to know the passage you read us because it's absolutely fabulous. Was that first source material of him actually having this much pressure from his family to be that? Because to me, I was like, oh my God, I thought I had pressure. Can you imagine your parents being like, hey, you need to be president and it has to be 2 terms because you have to, lift the family honor? I'm like, dude, really?
Yes. So I guess I'll say on the one hand, much of what I just read as the sample is real in that these are the sort of things that his parents communicated to him, that his father, that quote about the circumstances you came from mean that if your success is mediocre, it will disgrace you. Like that was an actual quote. Several of the other pieces were quotes and through various context that I sort of brought together for a single scene, which is kind of part of what historical fiction does. The quote from Abigail Adams's mother about, if you are not the most virtuous person in the world, then I wish you had just died in the Atlantic. That was an actual quote. That scene kind of helps set the foundation for Adams's character arc throughout the book, of that what he's trying to do is take advantage of the Spanish Empire's collapse in order to help set the United States in a better position in control of the North American continent. And he thinks that if he does that, the people will appreciate him and elect him president. So there's both kind of the patriotic and also the somewhat self-serving reasons for why he's doing that. But this scene kind of shows that his parents are really reinforcing that, like, it's an outcome that must be achieved or else, you'll have disgraced yourself. And I found that to be very interesting, because I think so many people can just relate to the general concept of parental pressure to succeed. People who read the book will see that he had similar, that sort of carried over into how he treated his own sons. And so you kind of have this intergenerational pressure to sort of be very ambitious. But at the same time, if you look at what his mother is saying, it's not just ambition, you also have to be absolutely virtuous, which are not the most compatible concepts, extreme ambition and extreme virtue. And so the entire novel, he is wrestling with these concepts. He was a very obedient son. He felt like he couldn't really question his parents. I mean, because probably this was an older period in history, so it was just more common just to sort of listen to your parents. Every word had to be followed. And he didn't fully grasp, I think, what his parents were doing to him. Now we would use a concept like mental health, like what that type of pressure, both in ambition and in virtue, what that does to a person. And I think that was a very interesting thing to sort of play out throughout the novel. It's not just these political and diplomatic maneuverings of his sort of showdown with Europe over South America, as well as the political alliances that are formed and broken and all of that, but also this very sort of intimate kind of personal journey of he wants to fulfill what his parents, demanded of him. As he, says in that passage, they were asking for the impossible, or what seemed to be impossible, a very hard outcome to sort of force into existence. And what that's doing to him sort of psychologically, and how he treats his own family because of that pressure.
We always take for granted the impact that our parents have on the decisions we make. I know a lot of people's like, I'll do what I want. It's like, we're a product of our upbringing and those influences. So to see that so played out and that contradictions, and you need to do all these things and be all these things and be so amazing. You're going, oh my God, and he's so hard on his kid. Like, he's just an idiot. And you're going, dude, really? So I'm loving it. I love how well you have described it for a person that we know so little about, even though, let's be honest, how many of us are going to go back and read 51 volumes of his journals?
Right.
Unless you're a historian or historical fiction writer, the rest of us are going, maybe not. How long did it take you to put this novel together?
This one was interesting, I think, probably because I had just had the experience of the Eisenhower novel. It was kind of like, and it was a similar topic, which again is kind of like why I wanted to take this on. I sort of knew the general approach that needed to be taken, and so that learning curve wasn't so much of a problem. I think just the wealth of material I wasn't quite expecting. So for about 3 months, I just kind of absorbed as much as I possibly could, and then just sort of jumped into the first draft. I knew the general direction of what it was going to be. That initially I thought it was going to be more of an episodic structure throughout his entire life, kind of what the Eisenhower Chronicles is. But then when I discovered that it was this showdown with Europe, and we haven't mentioned him yet, but sort of the main antagonist of the novel, a person that most Americans probably haven't heard of, but he's considered the greatest diplomat in European history, Prince Clemens von Metternich, who was an Austrian diplomat who played a very important role in defeating Napoleon and then organized this sort of balance of power between European countries that helped prevent another major war in Europe for 100 years until World War I broke out. So he's likely the greatest diplomat in European history, and he's the leader of this alliance of countries that are trying to keep the peace through force within Europe and who are trying to prevent South America's independence. And so the novel is largely a chess match between Adams, who's as America's greatest Secretary of State, versus Metternich, who is probably Europe's greatest diplomat. And so it's a conflict between them as well as other parties. That was the story to be framed in that context. I was sort of just immediately hooked because I was like, that's, a great premise for a novel. And so I knew that was the direction I needed to go in, and I figured out sort of what Adams's character arc was going to be. And so I'm usually more of a outline type of author, and there was definitely outlining involved here, but it was more of I'll figure it out as I go along at the same time because I trusted his diary and just the kind of basic framework I knew I was working with. And so after 3 months of kind of intensive research, I sort of jumped into it. And the first draft sort of grew over the course of about 6 months. And then the second draft was, I think, 2.5 months. And then the third draft was kind of like on nights and weekends over another couple of months, and that was it. So it was a little over a year in total.
It's not bad at all, especially with all the material you have to cover. So I love it. What are you working on now? Are you giving yourself a break? What is the next plan?
So I am giving myself at least a break for a few months. That this book was probably the most complex of any of the ones that I've done so far. It's a bit shorter than the Eisenhower novel. Just the content and the kind of plot structure is more complicated and kind of like ambitious to have to figure out. So I'm taking a breather for a few months. I feel like I've kind of exhausted the subject of American sort of presidential politics and foreign policy, at least for now, as far as like what I can sort of bring to the table with it. I have a JD, I went to law school, that I want to do a couple of novels, I think, about historical legal cases that deal with civil rights issues. And I found an interesting one about an enslaved man who fought for the British during the American Revolution in exchange for a promise for freedom, who was then captured by the patriot American side. And the legal argument that he and his lawyer came up with, I just find very interesting. And so I think that'll be probably my next project.
Ooh, I love it. You do know we want to hear about it when you have them ready. So we need to know. So question, love, where can our listeners find you, where they can learn more about these books? Where are they located? Tell us.
So they're on, I think, all the major book selling platforms. So Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and any of the other sort of usual suspects, to quote Casablanca. And then also my author website at mbzucker.com.
Love it. Love it. One of the things that I always want to know from authors, especially ones who have been working in the field and have actually experienced different layers when it comes to the writing process, what advice would you give an up and coming author? Let's get that before we jump into the lightning round.
I think keep at it would be one. Sort of, it is hard for numerous reasons, but whatever, either self-doubt or outside pressure, just if you think you have the talent, if you love it as a field and just taking on each of these projects, I think if you keep at it, you will grow as a writer and you will sort of grow in your fan base. Whatever the outcome looks like, you will make it in some fashion. And kind of along with that, I think, is to focus more on kind of what you're doing and the process of it. Listen to other people, but like ultimately trust your own instincts and voice. And if you care more about the process and improving what you're doing, that everything else will bother you less and won't become a distraction or a deterrent.
I love it. Okay, dear. Are you ready for the lightning round?
I am. Let's go.
Easy peasy. Hopefully I didn't ask you this before, but we're going to go with that. Sweet tea or unsweet?
Unsweet.
Okay. Breakfast or dinner?
Dinner.
Ebooks or print?
Print, although I was more ebook in college, but not anymore.
Okay. Skiing or swimming?
Swimming.
A little different. One food that describes your personality.
I grew up in Arizona, so I really like, like Mexican food and things like that. I don't know if I say like burritos with hot sauce, if that implies, I'm not even sure what that would imply, but I'll
Lots
just
of
go
layers.
with, sure, I'll just go with that.
We'll do that. It's always a pleasure chatting. Congratulations on the new release. I am excited for you. Any closing remarks?
So this book will have come out in November for the 200th anniversary of the Monroe Doctrine, and then other novels about historical fiction, the Eisenhower Chronicles, Theodore Roosevelt and the Hunt for the Wild Floridon, and A Great Soldier in the Last Great War are all available. And yeah, I think anybody who sort of likes historical fiction, sort of character depth or dialogue will, hopefully this will be a catalog that can be read and enjoyed.
Some to our listeners, go ahead and check out the fabulous Mr. MB and his books. You want to check it out, check out the website. You're going to love it. And if you have any questions, make sure you send us a note. We're here to help you out to find the next loving book that you guys are needing. In the meantime, make sure to subscribe. By the way, we have one more episode this week to wrap up our season for 2023. So make sure to subscribe because we'll be back again in February. So one more episode this week and then we'll be gone for the season. So I can't wait to hear what you guys think. In the meantime, have an amazing day.